Hi, and welcome to the Cyber Insurance News and Information Podcast. Today we've got a really fascinating guest, Kurtis Minder. He is a technologist, cybersecurity expert, ransomware. He's been at this stuff since the 90s. He's worked at everything from AT&T to startups. Most recently, he founded and then departed from GroupSense when it was sold. And he's also the author of a book, Cyber Recon. And I just want to read and I'm going to look at my notes to get it right. Cyber Recon, My Life in Cyber Espionage and Ransomware Negotiation. So, Kurtis, it's wonderful to have you, and I think that tips us right up. Before we dive into the ransomware negotiation stuff, tell me a little bit about your career, how you got to this point, and how you became interested in, I guess, technology broadly. How did it all start for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the very beginning is the only part of my career that wasn't like an accident. In the very beginning, my dad worked in a factory. He was packing flour for Pillsbury, the Doughboy company, right? And when I visited him when I was a kid, he was in this loud, you know, building with these huge earmuffs on, and there's flour powder everywhere, and it smelled bad, and it wasn't climate control. It was like 110 degrees in the summer. Then I went to my mom's work, and she worked as an accountant for the state of Illinois. And I don't know what she did exactly, but she sat in a chair and she typed on a thing, and she had a cup of coffee. And I remember as a kid, after going to both of those, like the extreme different environments, I was like, whatever that is. So I took every keyboarding class. This is before they had computers in school, so they had keyboarding and formatting 101 with an actual typewriter. And then I went to Barnes and Noble and ordered books that I couldn't afford to buy. They would deliver them. I wouldn't pick them up. They'd end up on the shelf. Then I'd go read them. I probably owe Barnes and Noble some money. And so I read books on Unix, and it was a very deliberate path to get into tech so that I could not work in a factory. That's how I got started.
So you were one of the very early people to hack Barnes and Noble, like it sounds like, pre-internet days.
I at least
right?
hacked their system a bit, yeah, and how they order books. But yes.
So we've got a few topics to discuss today with ransomware, cybersecurity broadly, cyber resilience, how cyber insurance impacts the ransomware negotiation space, and then you've written a few pieces on your website, which people can see right there, and some of them get into sort of really big thing stuff about the state of nation-state threats and the idea that we might already be in World War III. And we'll get to that later, but that's a little tease for the audience. So let's dive in. Ransomware negotiation. Can you give me an idea of how it starts for someone in your situation? Like, what's the first notice you get from a client, or maybe it's someone you don't know? How does it all begin?
Well, I mean, like anything, it depends on whom the victim is. I think how I get involved, but for the cases that we did at GroupSense, we were typically brought in by either a law firm that had a breach practice, fairly large law firms, usually global law firms, or a cyber insurer. And the first engagement with the client also very different based on the size of the victim, right? So for the clients that came in through GroupSense, which were quite large, they are, it's a boardroom full of people. I'm on a Zoom typically, not there in person. I'm on this big screen on the wall, and you've got your CEO and CFO and internal and external counsel and somebody from the technical staff, and there's a room full of people. And we typically start off by taking inventory of where we are in the incident response plan, and also me getting an idea of, like, have you engaged? Please no. But if you have, what has happened so far? And that's how it starts. On the smaller end, so I do a lot of sort of pro bono work for small businesses, and so that's very different. As you can imagine, instead of having a boardroom full of people, it's Mary's accounting firm in Des Moines, and she's got 8 employees that she's going to have to lay off if we don't solve this by Wednesday. It's a very different scenario, and I will say, though, in both cases, Martin, it is heartbreaking and stressful, and also you end up sort of becoming a de facto therapist for the victim.
That's a good point. You mentioned when we spoke before that sort of empathy and the human factor is really important. And we've all seen movies where it's maybe a hostage negotiation or a ransomware negotiation, and there's stress and music, and maybe you've read books about that, or there's book by FBI profilers and that sort of thing. That part of it strikes me as something that people might think doesn't exist because we're so detached from the reality of how all our tech works and the ones and zeros. I mean, I
Right.
use this line with some regularity. The list of things that would exist if I wouldn't, excuse me, the list of things that wouldn't exist if I was the only person left is as long as any list's ever been. And most of it's got ones and zeros involved with it.
Right.
Do you think
Right.
that is it's important to remember that? Like, tell me about that part of it. Go into that a little more because one of the things that I think important for our audience is to understand that there's a real human factor in all this sort of thing. There's guilt and blame and fear and, like you said, laying people off and letting people down, or the business being disrupted and that sort of thing.
Sure.
Tell me some more about that.
Well, I think you make a good point. I mean, I think it's just going to increasingly be the case that it's easy to dehumanize sort of the situations we end up in because of technology. I think it adds a sort of complex layer of abstraction to our real lives, and it's not just on the victim side. I think it's also important to understand that our adversaries or our opponents are also humans, and they have motivations and needs and they have egos and all of those things. And I think something that we do a lot in cybersecurity in general, which I've been doing some version of that for 30 years, is we dehumanize our opponent. And they are people. They have a reason for what they're doing, whether we agree with it or not. And the lens that they may see the world through, they may see this as completely justified. And that changes how you interface with them. That changes how you talk to them.
You make a really good point. There's a really, really good book called Achilles in Vietnam, and it's written by a psychiatrist who treated Vietnam veterans with PTSD. And one of the elements of the book is that dehumanizing exacerbates the chance of mental health issues following conflict, but it also makes you less likely to win, very, very simply put, because you underestimate. And that's a classic
Right.
failure in any kind of conflict situation, is underestimating and not having an understanding of your enemy. It's funny. I often think of the word empathy is often used too softly, and empathy is really trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes so that you can appreciate where they see things. And in an adversarial situation, that creates advantage. So
Yes.
you touched on the cyber criminals, the bad actors. We these phrases get tossed around. When you deal with them, how does that manifest itself in a literal way? How do you actually communicate with
It varies, but for the most part, the majority of the cases, if I'm interfacing with a threat actor in a ransomware case, it's through the dark web. So they'll leave behind a ransom note to the victim. On the note, I think one thing that's important for people who aren't familiar, the ransom note never actually contains the ransom amount. So you don't know, as a victim, you don't know how much they're asking for until you talk to them. And that's an important thing to know because it is a very important decision point. Do you talk to them just to find out how much they're going to ask? Are they going to ask for $5 or 5 million? You don't know, right? But on that ransom note, they'll have very specific instructions on how to get on the dark web and how to contact them. And usually, it's a dark web website, looks kind of like a normal website, except the URLs, the website address is very funky. And then it's specific to your instance. That website exists solely for you. And when you go there, there'll be a box that's basically a chat window embedded in the browser. And that's where most of the dark web conversations happen with the threat actors. There are cases where we talk to them over anonymous email. There are cases where we talk to them over point to point communications like Tox or Jabber or something like that. But most of the time, it's on one of these dark web embedded chat rooms.
so one of the things you touched on is that there's a lot of misconception about this sort of how this all unfolds in the media, and it gets I don't know what I forget what word you used, but that idea that there is a sort of I mean, it sounds like a text-based conversation in the simplest form.
It feels a lot like a SMS or like a iMessages conversation. Yeah.
And when does it come again? I'm just trying to imagine it. Does it you send a message and then you wait for a reply depending on where they are geographically, or do you get replies instantly, or I guess it must vary a great deal. But is it a mixed bag of how fast these sort of
It's a mixed
communications
bag, but
flow
that's
back
a
and forth?
really yeah, it's a mixed bag, but that's a really informed question because that's one of the things that I talk to the victims about. So we having done I don't know how many hundreds of these over the last 6 or 7 years, I think I have a rough idea of how each threat actor group is going to behave if I know them, and I know many of them, so I can set those expectations. But one of the things that I tell the victim is that this incident is the most important thing in the world to you, not to the bad guys. They have multiple victims. They're not on the hook for anything, frankly. They can decide to take a vacation. We've had bad guys do that. Say, hey, it's Friday afternoon. We'll talk to you on Monday. We're going to the lake. They've done that. And so that's something that the victim has to understand is that, your expectation that they're going to immediately respond to anything you're going to say is not, it's not warranted at all. But most of the time they've got the larger groups will have a group working in shifts to talk to the victims in our time zones. There are also a lot of cases where if the victim can afford it, we will purposefully time those messages and create a certain cadence to them on purpose as part of the strategy.
So you touched on two things just now that I think are betrayed by when you ask ChatGPT for the image of a hacker and you get a hoodie wearing, well, I guess teenagers. They could very well be teenagers, but the ransomware note comes with instructions, and they're highly organized, right? So they know that they might be trying to get money and extract the ransom for people who don't understand the dark web or technology at the same level as them. So they want to remove the friction with regard to the quote unquote purchase. And then also they take weekends off or work in shifts, or they understand that not everyone's on the same time zone and you have to sort of overlap your shifts. Like I mean that suggests to me that what I've been told by several people is that this is highly organized activity. It's not some sort of you know willy-nilly kind of outfit that you're dealing with generally.
I mean, there are willy-nilly outfits, for sure, but most of the ransomware groups are pretty organized, and they function a lot like a business. They have, middle management and water cooler conversations, and they have bonuses and quotas and all of the things that you would expect from a business.
But again, I mean, the water cooler, right? It's in every office, I suppose.
Right?
So when
Yes.
you get these one of the things that so everyone watching this, even people who aren't in the cybersecurity space, have heard the phrase ransomware, and I guess it rings a bell because it's got the word ransom in it. Um, why is it ransomware, not just ransom? Where does that? Do you have any idea the etymology of that?
I guess I don't know if that's funny. I don't think I've actually looked up the etymology of that word, but I do
Yeah.
understand because it is software. So the original version of this is a form of malware or software, malicious software that is designed to facilitate a ransom. So I could see where they just kind of Voltroned. I don't know if anybody's going to get that Voltron those two words together to make ransomware. So it did make sense. I will say that there are a fair number of groups now that are solely focused on extortion. They don't actually deploy that software. They just steal data and then use it to extort the victims, which is they still call that ransomware, but it's sort of a misuse, I guess, of the term at this point. It's taken a bigger meaning. Yeah.
So that gets me to my next question: is there's the exfiltration of data and the encryption of data. These are two separate sort of tactics within what's now broadly called ransomware. What changes in that situation? Is one of those, I don't know, worse, easier to deal with? Is there a from the victim side and the side working for the victim? What changes with regard to those two different types of things?
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of a double extortion. It's almost like a little bit of insurance for the ransomware actors because if for example they have not done a good enough job of disrupting the backups or recovery processes of the victim, if they just deployed the ransomware, the people will just recover and never pay the ransom. However, if they also took all of this critical data before they did that, and that data includes employees' personal information, healthcare information, or critical contracts, intellectual property, email conversations that might be found embarrassing or disruptive to someone's family or life or business. All of those things are a lot of leverage, and so they've got a second card to play if the ransomware itself is not enough to get the victim to pay. It's subjective, on whether which one's worse. I mean, it depends on the business and the operational impact and so on, but they're both bad. I can tell you that.
I mean, it sounds to me, I mean, the word unique gets overused and misused a lot. It's sticking to the actual definition of unique, meaning one of a kind. Is it your experience that fundamentally each ransomware negotiation is unique to itself and the circumstances that any particular organization or company finds themselves in?
Certainly the cost equation is unique, I think, for almost every single organization, or the impact, sort of analysis, the quantitative elements of that are unique. The interactions with the threat actors can be quite formulaic, right? Which they have a playbook, I have a playbook. We know each other's playbooks. We still do it. So, I mean, some of it can be a little bit monotonous for the person who's interfacing with the threat actor.
So you touched on it a second ago, paying and negotiating. Is it a classic, they start high, you start low and meet in the middle, or what affects where the starting points for what someone's willing to receive or pay? How does that evolve over the course of these communications?
Yeah, I think this is actually one of the and when we talk later about sort of the insurance role in this and stuff like that, I think this might come back up. But having a professional negotiator is, if you want to drive a better outcome, is important. Just having someone raise their hand is like, I'll argue for you. That's not. They might call themselves a negotiator. There are people who practice this science and know what they're doing. What you just described is a very traditional positional bargaining, and a lot of the negotiation transcripts I've seen that don't go well start with that. And I think you're going to end up there on every case, nearly every case. You're going to end up with this positional bargaining, but you don't want to go there immediately. You want to delay that as long as possible. In that, and to answer the first part of your question, which is like what sets the sort of starting price. So first, let's talk about how the threat actors handle that. Most of them will look at business intelligence tools, the same ones that like salespeople would use to sell to a company. Like they actually have Zoom Info accounts because they send me screenshots of the Zoom Info records, right? So they're looking them up in regular old business intelligence tools. The clients, they say, well, your revenue was this, and we're taking 5%, right? Something like that. So some of them have a system and an equation. Unfortunately, they're not business people, and they don't understand like profit and loss and margin. And so it's like sometimes you have to explain to them like, hey, that doesn't mean I have that much cash in the bank. That's not what that means. So you have to explain to them. But there's also this concept of perceived value that, especially with the data that they, on the extortion side, the data that they've taken, they may overvalue that, and it's our job to tell them, hey, that we agree that that data that you've taken has value. We think that you've misunderstood what that value is, and walk them through that and help them come to their own conclusion to set a more realistic price. And you got to do this several times before you get to the little positional bargaining thing. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a crappy number.
Do you get the sense that if you make an offer over the dark web and I gotta get back to you, and they have to go have a chat with their boss about whether it's okay to move to this price point? I mean, does it have that kind of very conventional businessy negotiation kind of sense to it?
Yeah, it's like the guy at the used cars dealership. Like, I got to go talk to the manager. Yeah, they do that. And they have floors that the people you're negotiating with have floors that they can't go below without approval, and so they do have to go to their managers. And sometimes we'll notice a switch in the dialect or a switch in the English proficiency in the middle of the talk. That means the manager is actually at the keyboard now, right? He's like, move, and so that's what is it? The SNL skit, Nick Burns, the company computer guy. I don't know if you've ever seen that one. Jimmy Fallon plays the move. So yeah, that does happen pretty regularly, pretty frequently.
So you touched on cyber insurance a little bit ago, and you touched on things like backups and that sort of thing. Take me through, from a company point of view, assuming no one is immune from this potential issue, right? Everyone is susceptible, right? If you have an internet connection, it's potential for someone to get in. What are the things that exist? Cyber insurance, backups, routine. What are the things that companies can do that will help their negotiating stance in a ransomware situation?
Well, there's a standard sort of best practice cybersecurity stack that I think most established companies are applying. Those are not immune to this either. Some of the more advanced EDR technologies like endpoint detection and response, play play a big role. Segmentation, network segmentation, that's more of an architectural thing, so that it's more difficult to move between sections of the business. Uh, I think one of the most powerful tools is it's more of a reference framework than it is a technology, is zero trust or least privilege access for everyone. The tighter you lock that down, the smaller impact a threat actor can make in your environment. So those are very powerful. And of course backups and having some resiliency to those backups. So one thing about the backups is the threat actors will, once they gain access, they don't immediately execute these attacks, right? First, they're going to steal data. So that takes a while. They're sneaking that data out. While they're doing that, they're sort of casing the network and the business. They want to see, okay, who's in charge, right? Like, when do you do your backups? Where do they go? Which account executes the backups on each machine? Like, which user account does that? And so that they can disrupt those things. And they've gotten quite good at it. People sometimes come to these meetings overconfident. It was like, well, we've got great backups, and then they call us back a couple hours later and go like, they're all gone. so so it happens. The
So
bad guys are good at this.
you touch on something that I think people don't quite appreciate. These are not lightning fast events, right? It's what's the Mission Impossible movie where they break into the Kremlin and they make the fake hallway sort of image, and they slow. You
Hmm.
have to create a time period if you're the attacker to be in the space, and what you do then is you observe. You take the data that you're going to ransom, and then you also observe what defenses they may have within that uh, that you can sort of overcome or minimize with your actions while you're existing in their safe space within their perimeter unnoticed. uh, is that a layman's way to put it?
100%. And what I was going to also add to the technology stack slash sort of preventative measures is just assume that some version of this will happen someday at your organization and plan for that. So that I've been in a bunch of these, and I can tell you, I know who's both either has a plan and has practiced that plan, and who has not in the first 5 minutes. And so the organizations that have a good incident response plan that is ransomware intelligent, that's important, because some of the plans don't work in a ransomware case. They work in other cyber attacks, but not a ransomware case. But then also having done tabletop exercises where they practice that plan, night and day in as far as the outcome, night and day.
You yeah, I mean, again, like so much of this. So I mean, you referenced the sort of accounting firm with 8 employees, but the truth is, even very large corporations are, in some respects, even at the C-suite level, detached from the concerns or risks. It certainly seems that way anyway. And the thing I always think is that while all this feels super new, things like segmentation is that's just, you've got a big building and your pass doesn't get you through every locked door. It only gets you through the locked doors that you're allowed to go to. So that if you want to go somewhere you don't normally go, you have to get special permission so that that movement and that access is noticed. I mean, I think that those sorts of things are, in the physical security world, they exist, and that idea that this is just invisible to us, it does create a lot of confusion. But it's just a new place, and given that we do so much in the digital space, adopting that more aggressive mindset to security is something that is, I mean, again, from my point of view as a journalist, it seems like the level of security that exists in the sense of cyber is pretty poor on in general around the world. Do you think that's too harsh, I mean, what do you think
No,
from your
no, I
experience?
don't. I'm still sort of surprised and disappointed because I get pulled in these cases where it's like they most of these companies could have avoided this or prevented the larger attack in any number of ways. And some of them have invested in quite a bit of consulting from the big five or whomever to help them build their response plans or their cyber infrastructure, and still miss some very basic things. And it is disappointing. And I don't think it's too harsh at all. I think at the board level, a lot of these companies, somebody at the board needs to be asking, hey, how seriously are we taking this? And somebody needs to own it. You know.
Yeah, I mean, talk about owning it. I assume you saw that the board of Qantas, the airline in Australia, or based in Australia, dinged their CEO pay and a few other executives over
I did see that.
the attack, cyber attack they suffered. Yeah, which I haven't had the time to look into, but I couldn't remember another occasion of a large company like that. I mean, they don't do that sort of thing in a lot of ways anyway, never mind over a cyber attack. So that struck me as something, you touched on zero trust. And again, I made the analogy to segmenting where your ID card could get you in a physical environment. I mean, I always thought of zero trust, like you would never allow employees to, oh, I forgot my badge, swipe me in, that kind of thing. That idea that everyone has to have their own key, their own badge, their own access, that and I know it's not, that's oversimplifying it, but that idea is we do this. We know that matters. I mean, the example I use with MFA is if you have an apartment with a one lock and then a deadbolt, well, that's two things that need to happen to gain access to your valuable space. And again, I
Right.
think that the your point about earlier about sort of a greater level of civilian and general population awareness about how important this is, and it's a little more, but that's okay. We're human beings are pretty good at doing things, and it's not that much more. And once you
Right.
get used to it, it's
Right.
natural. It just becomes the way you do it. And
Right. Well,
again,
I have
the
this
scale of the
answer I
problem.
give. I have this answer I give at conferences when I talk about that. The cyber sort of responsibility of cyber hygiene for citizens, because I do think it's a national security issue. And sometimes I'll be asked, oh well, now we all have to be cyber experts, Curtis, and the answer is no. Just like you don't have to be a doctor to know how not to die. These are very basic things that we can all learn. Right? It's not rocket science, and we're making just silly mistakes on a personal and professional level.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's. I mean, listen, I had grandparents who grew up without seatbelts or airbags, and I'm old enough that you never wore your seatbelt in the back of the car, and it was only a lap belt, and the idea that it takes no time, and it's again one of those things that if you make it part of your routine, it really doesn't feel like extra, but I think for a lot of people it seems a little daunting. I mean, particularly when you think about how many passwords we have and how many different
Mhm.
standards there are for MFA. Is it going to be a text? Is it going to be a token or whatever it might be? And I know a lot of people who are not unintelligent. They are not lazy, but it just feels a little bit overwhelming in a way that maybe my mom having to reset her VCR once did to her. So
Right, right. I get it.
you
I get it.
you touched on it.
But it'll come around.
Yeah, well, I'm of the opinion it's got to. I mean, from a purely economic point of view, the scale of the cost of this is, and maybe it's sustainable. I don't know, but it's depending on the numbers because the data about just how much is lost to cybercrime is a bit like vapor. I mean, you see a number as high as 10 trillion, 10.5 trillion. Some people throw that number out and it goes down from there. But that it doesn't matter. I mean, if you're getting into the T's, it's probably worth paying attention to.
Right.
When it comes to the ransomware situation, just jumping back a second, we touched on cyber insurance. Tell me about the role of cyber insurance in the situation. If you arrive, is it one of the first questions you ask a company to see their policy and to understand it? And tell me about that.
Certainly, and like I said, sometimes, actually, a lot of the time, cyber insurers are the ones bringing me to the table, so I know the answers to a lot of that. But I do think cyber insurance has played a positive role in the risk reduction because the years ago, not that long ago, maybe a couple years ago, you were going to get underwritten for a cyber policy. They sent you a survey that said, "Do you use cybers?" And you go, "Yep, I do." And then they send it back, and they're like, "Here's your policy." They don't do that anymore.
Like
They
a half a
check,
page,
right? They
it's like a
check.
half a page checklist, and that was yeah.
Do you use cyber? But yeah, now they do. They check, and I think that's forcing a lot of companies and companies who have better existing programs and or are investing in programs get their premiums reduced. So I think they're driving better behaviors. As an industry, I think on the response side, I think there's been some challenges where look, what I do, I get it. Like they're actuaries, right? They do math. It is highly subjective what I do, and there is no litmus test for negotiators, right? And there's no like core data set. And so what they have is they've got on their panels, they've got incident response firms and or law firms who have raised their hand and said, I can do that too. And the problem with that is some of them can and some of them cannot. And what I've seen is sort of a commoditization of the negotiation component that drives down the sort of the the quality of that, and that concerns me. Which is why, at GroupSense we actually launched a training course, and we trained our competitors on how to do this better. And we trained some of the top IR firms and stuff like that on the science of negotiation. So there wasn't just, somebody went back and read Getting to Yes again, and then then suddenly they're an expert. So we taught them, but I still think there's a lot of room to improve there.
So, I mean, you make a good point about the cyber insurers sort of driving companies to either improve what they've got or add things in general. And it reminds me of sort of and this is a bit of a simplification, but the early days of property and casualty, where the joke I make is an insurance company would go to a factory or a warehouse and say, "We'd love to insure you, but let me introduce you to my friend's sprinkler system over here, and we'll give you a discount on that. And once you've got that, we'll be able to charge you an amount you like, and it's also a risk that we're comfortable insuring at that amount." I mean, and that was, I mean, that business evolved. I guess it was about 120 years ago it started, but that idea that we're in this space where there's, in the best scenarios, this almost symbiotic relationship between the cybersecurity and cyber insurance sort of cohort, and obviously there are a lot of companies that provide sort of that active insurance. I think is one of the phrases you see used. Um, is there, when it comes to the ransomware scenario, are there elements to a cyber insurance policy that are must-haves or things that companies and individuals watching this might want to check in the wake of listening to this?
I mean, the only thing I would say, and I'm not an expert on the policies themselves, but I would say that not enough companies read the fine print of those policies, because it's not like I'm not suggesting that cyber insurance companies are trying to trick anybody, but what I'm saying is in the event of an incident, a lot of the policies dictate like timelines and orders of operations of whom you should contact and when, by what time, and all of that. And a lot of the companies don't know that, and it's really shitty time for them to start reading that during the incident, right? So they really need to read their policy and understand what the insurance company expects of them in an incident, so that they can take the best advantage of the insurance's offer.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about things like, retaining records of communications and stuff that they might require for you to prove that certain elements of the policy were met, and you need
But
to
also
collect that
like
data.
do not contact the threat actor until we've been engaged, right? Like so they don't call the insurance company after you've gotten in an argument with the bad guy. Don't do that, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, you touched on that, and I could tell how important that was when you got involved, and you were like, "Yeah, you haven't talked to them, right? Please say no. Please say no." I mean, that's you betrayed. We began with human emotion. You betrayed the primary concern walking into the room is you haven't touched anything yet, right?
Right, right. And often they have. And the problem with that is the bad guys don't care if we switch pitchers, right? You can't go like, "Hey, I'm not good at this. Bob's coming now. He's taking over. Can we start over?" And it's not an etch a sketch, right? Whatever you've said, it applies, right? It started a trajectory that is hard to reverse. And so that's difficult when someone is already engaged the threat actor.
And I can't. I just jumped in my mind now. I can't imagine how many movies I've seen where there's a hostage situation and it starts with some sergeant or beat cop trying to negotiate, and then the real negotiator comes in and he's said something and annoyed the hostage takers and all that sort of thing. Again, the humanity of this is one of the things that matters, right? Whether it's ransomware and all digital and over the dark web, or it's in person, people involved are very similar. They're motivated by the same sorts of things, and it's one of those things that at least I try to do in this space to remind me that as new as all this feels, it's all just people again. Like it's just human beings interacting in one way or another, and I guess that's something to touch on. You mentioned a couple
100%.
of things that make ransomware. You mentioned a couple of things that make the ransomware negotiation a little better, or things like the EDR stuff and that sort of thing. If you're a company listening to this now, is there a checklist of things that you might want to go through or make sure you've got that? I'm still amazed how few companies demand MFA, or they allow personal devices, or whatever, or they I mean, again, we've already touched on how poor cyber hygiene is broadly in society. What are some things a company should do to help build their cyber resilience and make them better off in a situation when it hits them?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hesitant to start listing off the entire security stack, but I think you mentioned, first identity and access management and MFA. everywhere that you can do it. Privilege access management. So that's if you need to do something with privilege, that there's a platform that manages who does that and how and what level of access they have, and then removes it when they're done and things like that. Those are really powerful tools. I think some of the things that are overlooked is, for example, and this is more on the licensing side, is logging. So once this event has occurred, when the forensic people show up to try to figure out exactly what happened in what order and do the bad guys still have access and all of that, they need logs. The standard licensing that a lot of companies are buying, for example, for their Microsoft suite, doesn't log enough data. So you have to know the necessary logging levels and things like that. So that's super important for the forensic side of things. And that also plays into one of the biggest mistakes that we see, the technical mistakes that we see happen on these cases is, you come into work and ransomware has affected your computer. It's not working normal. You can't figure it out. What do? Well, you've been kind of conditioned to restart that machine, right? You reboot it. When you reboot it, two things are bad about that in a ransomware case. One, the software that the bad guys are using is really good at encrypting your files. It's not entirely stable though. And so if you reboot when it's still running or something like that, you're probably not getting any of your data back ever. No matter if you buy the key or not, that data's gone. The other problem is there are key forensic items in memory that are erased every time you reboot that the forensic people need. And so I think I'm okay with people unplugging cables, like network cables. I'm not okay with them shutting things off. And we've seen a lot of mistakes with that as well.
That's really interesting. Because you see that panic, like pull the power plug out of, again, the movies. They don't get it all right. You've told me this
Right.
before.
Right.
One of the things you touched on, earlier, and I guess it always harkens back to sort of my military history days, is sort of the wargaming or tabletop exercising. If you're at a large company and you want to practice having a cyberware incident, and it should probably begin with a 2 a.m. call on a Saturday night to the CEO saying, "We've got a problem. We can't get into any of our systems." I mean, again, back to preparing us. We practice like you're going to play, and all these phrases you hear out of sports and military planning. No plan survives contact, so you have to have sort of an adaptability and a malleability with best practices in place. How important is that part of it? And because that's one of those things I can imagine feeling like that's no company retreat. That's a whole other day of work where you have the whole idea is to be consumed by this problem in practice, so that when it consumes you in real life, you have some sense of all the things that are going to go wrong, and we can't get the general counsel because they're on a plane right now, and that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah. There's two different levels of these sort of, we call them tabletop exercises, like you mentioned. There's a technical one, and I think a lot of companies think that that's the only one they need to do. And honestly, that one, and I'm a little bit biased, but I think that one is less important than the executive one. So no, like having the executive level tabletop is who decides who talks to whom. Like if the media is calling, what do we do about HR if the bad guys are using call centers to call our employees and scare them, which is a thing they do, right? Like just all of those big executive level decisions, you don't want to make them in a vacuum as they're happening. You want to understand like what the potential use cases are and agree to how you're going to respond well in advance of the actual incident. And so those executive level tabletops are super, super important. On the non-technical side, the biggest mistakes we see made are almost always along the lines of communication. Either communication to business partners, communication to the employees, communication to the outside world, media, et cetera. Those are the most expensive, sort of mistakes I've seen folks make. And those tabletops help you work through those scenarios, come to an agreement as an executive team as to if we're in the scenario, this is how we're going to handle it. And here's who's responsible for doing those components, et cetera. Super, super important.
Could you give me, anonymize an example of a mistake in that space that or a scenario that's
Sure.
more detailed?
Yeah, sure. Well, and I've seen it so many times in different variations. It's hard to pick one, but I think so. First of all, keep in mind, eventually this case is going to end, and you're going to want to get back to business, right? You you're going to need a tremendous amount of goodwill from your community, and that's all of your community, your staff, from a morale perspective, your business partners. Everybody's going to eventually know something. You're probably going to have to report it, so it's going to be public. So, I believe the quickest way for you to ruin that goodwill is to make them feel like you intentionally misled them during the incident itself. And so we've seen cases where, I worked a case where the ISO even previewed the communication they were going to send out to the media and the victim clients, because they were a service provider. A bunch of their clients were affected, and and he goes, "Hey, let me know what you think of this." And I said, "Well, aside from the fact that it's patently false, I think it's really well written." So I knew where that was going, and it ended up in a pretty nasty class action lawsuit, right? And so those kinds of things happen all the time. There was a case with a hospital chain where the hospital IT staff uh, were kept in the dark about what was actually happening. Now they're the people who are like, they need their help, but they will not admit to them that they're under a ransomware attack. And the IT staff eventually revolted and ended up talking to the media about this. And it blew up, right? It blew up in their face, and it cost them a lot of money. And so the communication part is just critical, and part of it's a company culture thing too. If you run your business on values, and those values include, transparency, honesty, things like that, this is a pretty good time to practice those values.
It's interesting, and again, I think it comes back to how we began talking about the human element of all this. That the communication part of it is one of the things that can trip you up in the sort of incident response element. And again, I think that, in crisis communications, which I know a little bit about, that idea that you don't have a plan, you don't have a protocol for, no one speaks to the media. Everything has to come through a single point, so that there's at least one choke point for things that we do, or whatever it might be, however you want to organize it. Um, it is surprising to me to well, it's not surprising. That's overstating it, but it's one of those things where it seems like one of those things that's so easy to overlook, I guess, is what I'm getting at. And so it's not surprise, but it's almost oh shucks. I mean, that it's not the first time that you hear stories about people being unprepared for when the train comes off the tracks, right? I mean, what do you
Right.
do? How do you
Right.
respond for the thing? I guess. Now, before we move on, there's a couple other things I want to cover. Can you take me through sort of a ransomware negotiation, or give me a couple of anecdotes about whether it's a funny thing or the roll your eyes kind of moment, or like tell me a couple of tales.
Sure. Again, there's like so many to choose from. It's hard to pick a particular one. So first of all, some of the threat actors actually perpetrate as if they're a business, and they're functioning like a business, like we talked about earlier. So they actually perpetrate. They actually personify that in the messages. They refer to the service they provided and getting paid for the service that they provided, and they provide tech support when they give you the code and things like that. And those same groups have relegated, and many of them have relegated to almost like fake legalese when you get to the end of the negotiation. So you're saying, okay, we've come to a number that we both agree on, and this is what you're going to do for the number. And there's a bunch of bullets that we give, and I'll just tell you some. So obviously, we're asking them for the decryptor, and we specify that it will decrypt all files, right? And we tell them they're going to delete the data and provide some log and or video of that deletion. That they're not going to attack us again. That if we're on the shame site, they remove us from the shame site. That they're not going to sell our information to other threat. It's just like a long list. We're trying to get as much for our money as we can. And those groups, of course, agree to all this, but they come back with this almost fake legal document that they put in. It's still just in the chat. It's not even a legal document. Where it's like, whereas party A will blah blah blah. Like they literally, it's like they watch too many you know law TV shows or something. That's I think that's funny. And then I have to be like, I Kurtis agree, or whatever to the to their legal document, which has no enforcement whatsoever. But it is
Yeah.
funny. And then and the tech support part is true. If you do have problems, it's not the same people you negotiate with. They'll turn you over to another chat group. Sometimes it's in a different platform like Telegram or something like that, where they will help you with the software if you have issues with it and stuff like that. So they do actually provide technical support. And there have been cases where we've applied some level of projected empathy to get them to lower the number for the victim. So we, for example, we got one group that basically uh, they were started at 2 million, and we got them to. They called it their cost of goods, which also refers to the fact that they're running a business. But they said their cost of goods for the attack. It was a cancer charity. Their cost of goods for the attack was 5,000, and so we settled on 5,000 so they could recoup their costs of the attack. Which, by the way, those are largely because they've bought that from something called an initial access broker, which is basically a bad guy who hacks into a company and then sells that access to other bad guys. So they probably that cancer charity is probably hacked by an initial access broker. He listed it on a dark web marketplace for $5,000. The ransomware guys bought it, deployed the ransomware, and then we paid them the $5,000 to recoup their costs instead of the 2 million they originally asked for. Yeah, we've had cases like that as well. It's very strange.
You touched on something another thing that I think that people might be surprised to hear. What's the scale from like the high to the low for the amount that's paid in ransom?
It's massive. I mean, and if you go back to the groups function like a business, some of them have different go-to-market strategies than others, right? So the go-to-market strategies for some of these groups is what we would call big game hunting. These are the guys that are trying to break into IBM and GE, and they're really focused on a small number of very high value brands. They're asking for tens of millions of dollars typically when they do these attacks. So there's been cases of upwards of 50 or million. And those are based on probably business intelligence tools. They say, "Oh, you made X number of billions of dollars, and so, this is a rounding error for you." Then there are groups who are more like a spray and pray or sort of opportunistic in nature, and they're doing a volume play. So they attack more victims, but they ask for smaller amounts in the tens of thousands. I don't see many below 100,000 anymore, but most of them, are just kind of opportunistic in nature. They're not targeting specific companies.
I had a guest on, a journalist out of the UK, a guy named Danny Palmer, fascinating guy, and he's been covering cybersecurity for I guess almost 15 years now. And his first story was about a local council in England that was ransomware, and the ransom was £500. So talking about how far we've come.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's like in the petty
Yeah,
cash
exactly.
drawer, right?
Exactly. Hold on, where do I meet you?
Right.
One of the things that you see now, and it's popped up, the place I've seen it more sort of talked about in a more coherent way, is the banning of ransomware. And I've heard all kinds of
Mhm.
arguments for and all kinds of arguments against, and it varies from sector to sector. Do you have any thoughts or ideas about that? What it might do?
Man, do I. Oh, man, do I.
Go on then.
Yeah. So, and this is something I've briefed a couple of committees in Congress on this. I've been trying to raise this flag again recently because I do believe this is both a national security issue, a significant drain on our economy. Um, However, and also it is unethical, and that's something we talked about before we started recording about. If we're paying a ransom and that ransom money is used to harm human beings, probably shouldn't do it. The problem is that a lot of these companies don't have a choice. So that for every brand name company we hear about on the news, thousands of small businesses are hit every day, and they're either going to go out of business or pay the ransom. If your goal from banning ransoms or making it illegal was to reduce the number of ransoms paid, I don't think you'd actually achieve that, because keep in mind, this happens over cryptocurrency and dark web. You're just not going to hear about it. They're going to pay it because they don't have another choice. They've got two options. I have been campaigning for the creation of a third option. I think there's a pretty easy ROI that you could calculate, return on investment you could calculate from a federal perspective. And given that it's a national security issue as well, that we really put some teeth behind our prevention and response programs, and help some of these companies recover and give them a third option. I don't think banning it's going to solve it.
I mean, is that almost like some sort of quasi like public backstop, like a governmental type of, like you get the weight of America behind you? Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
that's
and I
what you
mean
mean. I mean,
that could be run through something like CISA. CISA never really had any teeth. It was largely like an advisory service. I think that organization could be equipped to do that kind of work, if Congress could get behind it.
I mean, you touch on. I wrote a piece up earlier today. It was a white paper report on Zurich and a few other groups about their argument was we needed a common language basically for the cyber metrics and that sort of thing so that we could measure things with the same words. And it just struck me, and I wrote in the piece. I said, we don't even have a common language where cybersecurity and cybersecurity are either one or two words. Like some people use it as two
Right.
words, some people use one word, and that's how far we are given the lack of reporting and the sort of the invisible parts of this. To your point about the thousands of companies that get ransomware and they just sort of pay it and move on, like, oh, that sucked. Let's just get on with our day. And I think
Right.
that's one of the issues in the cyber, with underwriting cyber insurance and the level of risk versus the level of insurance that exists. That it's hard to know about this because so little of it is public. And again, I think
Right.
that's part of sort of moving into the next section where we talk about, you know, as individuals or as a society or as a population, we have a responsibility in the cyber sense, not unlike we have a responsibility to drive appropriately on the road and to
Right.
not drive like lunatics. So there needs to be some sort of national standard for cyber insurance, excuse me, for our behavior in the cyber world to create cyber reliance, not unlike there was standardized things like car safety and speed limits that brought road traffic deaths down in America, right? Those things save lives, seatbelts, airbags, whatever it might be. I was wondering if you could touch on that bigger idea, that sort of societal idea, because one of the things that I've said, I'm a big history buff, so I always use this. One of the analogies I use is that I feel like, as far as, I mean, I'm 54, so I wrote checks and used stamps to pay my first rent, and I remember dial-up coming into my home in the '90s and that sort of thing. Are at the very beginning of technology, not unlike we might have been at the beginning of the industrial age. And I feel like we're almost in the Model T4 days of this from a historical point of view, where we've got a car and it's unbelievable, it's revolutionary, and no one's ever seen anything like it. But give it 50 years and you won't have any. It's gonna amaze you what exists
Right.
with regard to this space. And part of that, and part of creating resilience around there, given the fact that people are always going to try and steal things from where we put them, and we put everything we value into digital spaces now, well, not everything, but the enormous number of things, that we need to ingrain at a very early age a digital version of look both ways when you cross the street, if you will. And I wonder what you think about that from a grade school level and societal level.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first I want to, go back to the beginning of your question where you're using the metaphor of like seatbelts and airbags and things like that. I think it still fascinates me that most of the cyber vulnerabilities are in the software that we're using. I didn't write the software. Software vendor did. They didn't put the seat belts on there. They didn't. Nobody's making them put the seat. Nobody's holding them accountable for that. And I think that's an issue, right? It's like I don't. I have to use this stuff to function in the real world. Look, I'm a technology guy for 30 years. I have no idea how my iPhone works. No clue. It's an appliance, right? I'm trusting that these guys built it correctly so that people can't just get in there, right? And so that's an issue. I think part of it. It's there's two parts, and then the other part is to what you said. Like there are some best practices, and to me, I think the word hygiene is pretty good because it's like we understand we got to wash our hands, we got to brush our teeth, we got, there's some basic things so we don't get sick and we don't, and we don't smell bad or whatever. So I think those simple things, yeah, I think we need to teach those early and often and make them part of the habit of your daily life. And some of it's really simple stuff. Like, when I give a talk, sometimes I'll talk about the cyber hygiene stuff and I'll say, hey, that box that pops up when you're playing Words with Friends or Wordle or whatever, and it says that you need to update your phone. Stop playing the game and update your phone. Your software provider has made a mistake that they're trying to fix. And if you keep ignoring it, it's
Well,
going to be a problem for you. And that's I think everybody has a responsibility there. Yeah.
so I haven't finished it yet, but I've started to hobble together some words for an op-ed on our site. That the bug fix is the most understated phrase in the world. Like, oh, it doesn't, bug fix, like, because that's what you
Right.
see, right? Bug fixes and other stuff, you
Right.
know.
Right.
But I mean, that you make a really good point because you get the OS update and then the apps need to be updated, and that's just your iPhone, and it is. Again, I think I said this recently on one of our podcasts. It is updating your software on whatever devices you're using is one of the biggest things you can do to take advantage of the help that's coming from outside, from the providers of the software we use. And it is, again, it's so easy to ignore, you know? I mean,
Yeah,
maybe I'm wrong, but
I
it
get
feels to
it.
me like with
I get
OS.
it. It's
Yeah.
disruptive, right? But you know, to have to stop whatever you're doing and do this, it can be disruptive. But do you know what's more disruptive? Ransomware.
Yes, I do.
So click the
I
update
feel like
button.
I feel maybe I'm just noticing it more because it's frequency syndrome because 'cause I've been at this work for a couple of years now, but I feel like Apple now when they release an OS update, if there's media or publicity around it being, quote, unquote, maybe an urgent security update to try and, trigger people to
Yep.
make the choice to
Yep.
do it with more expedience. And I don't know if that's true or not. I'll maybe, if I can find anything about
I
that,
would
I'll
buy
throw it
that.
in the yeah.
Yeah.
Because it is important. I think, like you said, like most of us don't have any idea how this exists. And the joke I make, and I made it earlier, is that, none of this would exist if I were the only one left. But we all use it every day. But I don't understand how my carburetor works. I don't understand how, I
Right.
mean, I barely understand how the lock on my door works. Right? I mean, I get it, but
Right.
you only care when it doesn't work. And I think again, trying to make it more like everything else in our lives because it is all over our lives. I mean, we basically have these attached to ourselves now, and that's
Right.
only going to increase. That's not going to change. And this part of it all, I mean, the security always lags, right? We always delay. We put off things until, I mean, our language is replete, right? You don't close the barn door until the horse gets away or whatever it might be and that kind of
Right.
stuff.
Right.
So, yeah, I want to pivot now as we sort of move towards our close. One of the pieces you have, and this gets to something that I'm a big proponent of, is that the idea that we are in, and I can't remember the exact title, so let me pull it up here, and I will read it. Bear with me. It is basically, are we losing a war we didn't know we were fighting? And the first line is World War III started years ago, and you wrote that in 2023. So tell me what you mean by that piece and what you've got in there.
Well, it's fairly complex, and I could talk for an hour on this topic alone. So I'll try to distill it down to the basics. But so uh, our opponents, our geopolitical opponents, whether it's China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, let's just pick on them for a minute. Their their strategy for disrupting our way of life and getting the upper hand is a complex and clever one, and I don't think we give them enough credit. So, for example, Russia has the way you translate cyber war in Russia, it translates to they don't even have like the same concept as we have a cyber war. So when you think of cyber war, Martin, you think of like cyber offensive activities toward an opponent's systems, right? You think of it kind of in this almost narrow, like that's what we're doing. We're going to attack their systems. That's not how they think about it. The way they translate it, and I forget the Russian word. Forgive me. I sometimes can recite it, but today is not the day. So, um, but it basically translates into a broader definition of information warfare. And information warfare isn't just technical. For them, that is disinformation. That is the whole concept behind this Russian information warfare is you confuse and disrupt the enemy in a non-obvious way. You steal their resources. You create distrust within their network. You all of these things, and you do it in a way that they don't know what's happening. That's what ransomware is. Ransomware is a bunch of basically, organizations inside Russia with impunity attacking Western targets, disrupting our way of life, hurting our operations. People are losing their jobs, and then taking our money and using it for the things that they want on that side of the ocean. China does it for intellectual property. Iran does it to fund their nuclear program. So they're all literally waging an active war on us, and we're like, it's just hackers. No, it's not. It is deliberate, and it's been deliberate for a decade. And we're not from a policy perspective, we are not taking it seriously enough.
You know what? It reminds me of the phrase sort of death by a thousand cuts or sort of a low grade fever.
Hundred
I
percent.
mentioned when I chatted with you earlier that I had done military history documentaries and I worked on a TV show for the History Channel a couple of years ago. And one of my business partners is a POW MIA sort of aficionado,
Wow.
particularly from the Korean conflict. And one of the things we know that Americans who were taken prisoner during the war and then were interrogated by, say, Russians or KGB officers, when they were back, they were encouraged to become Manchurian candidates. Now, the movie takes it to the person becomes president, and they're actually, like
Right.
a Russian agent or whatever it is. But in actuality, the sorts of things they would be encouraged to do were much like what you're describing. It would be, listen, when you move home, we want you to get your job back at the factory. But when you have the union meeting, we want you to rabble rouse and we want you to talk about being more socialist. We don't want you to run for mayor and try and introduce socialism. We just want you to disrupt the everyday events that go on within your labor union, to sow discontent and to upset people and make people kind of agitated. And fast forward to now, in a digital sense, it's exactly the playbook. And this is,
100%.
there's lots of great books about the KGB and this sort of thing that they did through the Cold War and that sort of stuff. But that idea that they're playing a they're playing a game with a profoundly large goal, and we're looking at it like pesky little kids in a basement hacking Marks and Spencers, right?
Right. Right. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. And I mean, and this, like you said, this isn't new. These tactics aren't like revolutionary. They've been doing this for a half or more a century, like maybe 70 plus years. They've been doing this very successfully on the national stage. And it hasn't, long before the internet, they were doing disinformation campaigns and things like that. So they know what they're doing. And we know that they know that, and we still don't apply it here. And I don't understand. It's very
Do
frustrating.
you think, I mean, well, no, well, it is. I mean, do you think that there is a need for something not unlike how we sort of stopped acid rain, or atmospheric nuclear testing, among the countries you can get to come to the table to agree not to do this, to help put it out there that A, it's a huge problem for nations around the world, and B, it's not good for the globe in general. Is that kind of, because there's no geography with these sorts of crimes. Anywhere you have the internet, you can do this. I'm just curious what you think is a step towards some sort of, broader global solution to this problem, because
So I'm
it is a
not
global
I'm not an
problem.
expert. I'm not an expert in this, but Andy Greenberg in his book Sandworm. If you've ever read that book, but it's pretty awesome. So if you might remember in Sandworm, they tried to do that at the UN Security Council, and the country that motioned for it was Russia, and the only country that would refuse to sign on was the United States. And so it was almost like we want to wage cyber war, so we're not going to sign this thing. Well, we kind of screwed ourselves because we're losing. And so I don't know why we did that, but I think that this has been attempted. This sort of agreed, hey, we're not going to do this to each other, and we're going to agree as a globe not to do this to each other. And the United States was the linchpin that kind of said we're not going to participate. We want the right to do this to this other countries. So
Be careful what you wish for, I guess. Is
right,
the moral of that story.
right.
So we've been chatting about an hour or so. So I want to let you get back to your day, and I know you got to get yourself home. Is there anything we've touched on that you want to say a little more about, or is there anything we didn't get to that we discussed in some of our pre-conversations that you want to say a little bit about?
Yeah, I think I'll touch on the ransomware response business. I think just for a second, considering that as a specific discipline and not something that you want to do flippantly, like find someone who's got some experience in it. I think what was unique about how we came into that business is we were a cyber espionage company. We were already spying on bad guys. Our team spoke 20 languages. We partnered with some of the top negotiators in the world, and we built a real scientific program around it. There's not very many firms that do this, but that there's a reason for that. It's non-trivial. It's quite an investment. That's number one. Number two is, I think we did sort of beat the proverbial horse, but I want to say it again that, everything's connected. There's a talk I do called it's called the digital butterfly effect. It's one of my favorite talks. And if you're familiar with the chaos theory of the butterfly flaps its wings in one part of the world and it affects some major thing like a tornado or something in the other side, cyclone, the concept is that, and by the way, the subtitle of this talk is From the Dry Cleaners to the DIB. And the DIB is the Defense Industrial Base, right? And I think too often, whether we're a small business or individual, we think I'm not important. So if the bad guys attack me, I'm not that important. Yes, you are, because it's all connected. And so in that talk, I draw a very quantitative line between a cyber attack against a dry cleaner and a national security incident. And so that just is to go back to our conversation about personal sort of responsibility and civil responsibility around cyber hygiene. Don't just do it for yourself, do it for everyone else. And
Yeah, I mean,
so if we
there's
all, yeah,
no, I was going to say, the 6 degrees of separation is the wrong phrasing here, right? It's more like 10 million degrees of connection, right? There is no,
right,
and you hear this from companies when CEOs give their talk before Parliament about the cyber attack they suffered. It's almost like they've realized it for the first time. They've got 50,000 employees, and any one of them could be the entry point for someone to
right,
get inside the company. And then it's almost like, didn't you think about that before? And to the points we've made throughout this, tons of them didn't, or it wasn't high on their concern list or their radar or whatever it might be, which again is something that gets taken advantage of. Anything else you want to touch on?
nope, just buy my book, Cyber Recon.
So, Kurtis, thank you so very much. That book is Cyber Recon. There is a link in the show notes wherever you might be listening to or watching this, and I think it takes you to Amazon, or maybe it's Barnes and Noble, or maybe I put both. I'll have to let myself know when I actually do it. Kurtis, thank you so much for the time. I think you and I could probably talk about this in a variety of ways for a long, long time, and hopefully we'll have you back on to talk about something specific or an event in the news. But for now, again, thank you so very much. To
That'd
all
be
you
great. Thank
listening
you,
and
Martin.
watching, I'm Martin. Thank you again. To all you listening and watching, I'm Martin Hinton, Executive Editor of Cyber Insurance News. Thank you so much. Please like, subscribe, leave a comment. If there's a question I can't answer, I'll get it to Kurtis. And again, thank you so much for watching. Really, really do appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day, wherever it might be.